The alarm did not scream. That was the first bad sign. On a Vorkai ship, a screaming alarm meant something minor, a pressure fluctuation, a coolant spike, something the system was confident it could name, and therefore confident enough to be loud about. A screaming alarm meant the ship's brain had already found the problem, was already throwing crew at it, was already composing the incident report. A silent alarm meant the ship's brain did not know what was happening. The bridge of the endless patience went very quiet when the lights shifted from standard white to the particular shade of amber that no Vorkai officer ever wanted to see. Commander Zelvorn looked up from his station log. Navigator Preth looked up from her star charts. The two junior crew at the secondary consoles looked up from whatever junior crew look at when they think no one is watching. Nobody said anything. Then the second alarm came. This one was also silent. A different color. A deep, bruised orange that pulsed once, twice, stopped. Zelvorn stood up. He crossed the bridge in 8 steps, which was all the bridge permitted, and pulled up the damage red on the central display. The display gave him numbers. The numbers gave him a headache behind his left sensory lobe that he knew from experience would last approximately 3 days. The quantum manifold, the core of the ship's fold drive, the piece of engineering that allowed the endless patience. To be patient about distances that would otherwise take lifetimes, had cracked, not failed, not malfunctioned, cracked, like old ceramic, like something that had been holding stress for a long time and had finally, quietly, decided it was done. Secondary read, hull integrity at the rear cargo section, 62% and dropping. Tertiary read, fold drive offline, estimated repair time without parts, not calculable, estimated repair time with parts, dependent on sourcing. Zelvorn looked at the star chart. He knew this region. He had passed through it twice on survey runs, neither time stopping because there was nothing here worth stopping for. The nearest collective station was 40 light-years behind them, which was 6 months of sublight travel, with a cracked manifold and a leaking hull. The nearest uninhabited system with usable mineral deposits was 30 light-years ahead. Between those two options sat one inhabited system, Sol. He pulled the file. It was short, because short was all the file warranted. Class 3 civilization. Carbon-based, single inhabited world. 3rd planet, nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, 70% ocean coverage. Population, approximately 8 billion, which was high for a Class 3 but not remarkable. Technology level, pre-warp, pre-fold. They had achieved some basic rocketry. They had placed objects in orbit around their own planet. 1 or 2 crewed trips to their nearest moon, then apparently they had stopped doing that, which was the kind of detail that told you everything you needed to know about a civilization's organizational capacity. No off-world colonies, no deep space presence, no known contact with any collective member species. The collective standard classification summary at the bottom of the file read, low interaction risk, uncontacted reserve status. Proceed with standard non-interference protocol if passing within 2 AU. Zelvorn read that summary, read it again, then he looked at the hull integrity number, which had dropped another point while he was reading. He closed the file. Set course for Sol, he said. Sublight. Best safe speed with current hull status. Navigator Preth did not argue. You did not argue with hull integrity numbers. Chief Engineer Brix heard the order from down in the engine bay, through the open comm channel that Zelvorn habitually forgot to close. He was already elbow-deep in the manifold housing, which was less a repair posture and more a grieving one, the kind of physical closeness you offered something you could not fix yet and felt bad about. The manifold was cracked in a pattern he had seen once before, on a ship that had pushed its fold drive past rated limits for 6 consecutive jumps without maintenance. The endless patience had only done 4. Brix had told Zelvorn at Jump 3 that they should stop. Zelvorn had said the delivery schedule was the delivery schedule. Brix had noted his objection in the maintenance log, which would be very satisfying to read later, and not at all useful right now. He pulled himself out of the housing, wiped compound dust off his face, and pulled up the parts list on his wrist display. Quantum manifold core, Vorkai Class 7 or compatible, hull sealing compound, Type 4 or higher rated, coolant fluid, standard grade, secondary motivator cells if available. He cross-referenced against what the Sol system file said was available. The file said, primitive mineral extraction, some basic metallurgy, carbon composites in early development stages. Brix flagged the coolant fluid as potentially sourceable. Everything else he marked as unlikely. He added a note at the bottom of his list. We'll need to fabricate manifold core from raw materials if local sourcing fails. Estimated time, 30 days. Hull integrity may not support 30 days in orbit. Explore options. He stared at the note, deleted the last two words because they were not really words. They were just what engineers wrote when the situation made them want to lie down on the floor. He climbed up out of the engine bay and went to find something to eat. There was nothing he could do for the next 18 hours except wait and think about a Class 3 planet that probably had nothing useful and hope he was wrong about the manifold. He was, in general, not often wrong about manifolds. They came into the Sol system slow, running passive sensors only. Standard protocol for approaching an inhabited system. You listened before you spoke, you looked before you knocked. The passive sensor array came online. Brix was on the bridge by then, standing next to Preth because the bridge was small, and that was the only place left to stand. The display lit up. Then it kept lighting up. Prith made a sound that was not quite a word. The junior crew at the secondary consoles both leaned forward at exactly the same moment, which was the kind of involuntary synchronized movement that happened when what you were looking at was genuinely unexpected. Zelvorn said nothing. He just stood there and read the display. Satellites. Dozens. Then dozens more. The system populated the orbital map around the third planet in real time as the sensors resolved each object, and the objects kept coming. Communications relays. Navigation arrays. Weather monitoring platforms. Science instruments pointed in every direction. At the planet, at the sun, at deep space. A constellation of watching eyes that covered the entire planet in overlapping fields of view. And further out, in higher orbits, different objects. Heavier. Geometries that were not scientific. Geometries that were deliberate in a way that had nothing to do with watching weather. Military satellites. How many? Brix asked. Still counting, Preth said. Zelvorn pulled up the Class 3 file again. The file mentioned minimal space infrastructure, early orbital capability. He read that phrase. He looked at the display. He read the phrase again. He had a feeling that the person who wrote this file had not personally visited this system. The comm array started catching signals before the translation engine was even properly calibrated. They came in waves. Dense, layered, simultaneous, overlapping broadcasts on frequencies across the entire usable spectrum. The translation engine caught fragments and threw them on screen in broken strings. Weather Service advises residents of the coastal. Goal in the 89th minute, and the crowd. President is expected to address the assembly. Next caller, you're on the air. In a world where one man, the chicken, add the garlic, reduce heat to medium. Something that appeared to be music, something that appeared to be a dramatic performance, something that appeared to be two individuals arguing about a sporting result with an intensity normally reserved for actual conflict. Something in a language the translator did not have in its database at all, followed by something in 4 other languages simultaneously. The translation engine, which was a Vorkai Class 9 unit rated for simultaneous processing of up to 200 distinct signal types, produced a single line of output and then stopped. Signal volume exceeds processing parameters. Please reduce input. Brix stared at that line. It's asking the planet, he said slowly, to please be quieter. Nobody laughed. It was not a laughing moment. It was the kind of moment that arrived wearing the face of a joke, but had something else entirely underneath. Zelvorn ordered the translation engine to prioritize and filter. Drop entertainment signals, drop commercial traffic, focus on anything that looked like directed communication rather than broadcast. The engine processed for 40 seconds, a long time for a Class 9 unit. Then it flagged something. A tight beam signal, not broadcast, directed, pointed at the endless patience. With a precision that required knowing exactly where the endless patience was. The signal had been running for 11 minutes. Someone on the planet below had found them before the sensors had even finished counting satellites. Zelvorn felt the headache behind his sensory lobe sharpen into something more personal. They saw us, Preth said. Yes, Zelvorn said. The file said they had early radar capability, ground-based, short range. Yes. We came in from the asteroid belt. That is not short range. Zelvorn looked at the tight beam signal on the display. It was patient. It had been patient for 11 minutes. It was in no hurry. It was simply there, waiting, like something that had been waiting a long time and had learned how to do it well. They upgraded, Brick said. It was not an accusation. It was an engineering observation. The same tone he used when a system had developed beyond its expected parameters. The junior crew were very quiet. They spent 2 hours running full passive analysis before Zelvorn authorized active sensor sweeps, and the active sweeps did not make anyone feel better. The third planet, they had no reason yet to call it by whatever the inhabitants called it, was densely developed across every major landmass. Energy signatures in the medium-high range for a Class 3. Multiple large population centers with power output that suggested industrial development well into the upper bands of what the file's technology rating should have permitted. Brix pulled up the technology rating scale and looked at where Class 3 sat on it. He looked at the energy readings. He pulled up the technology rating scale again. Their power output is reading Class 4 low, he said to Zelvorn, quietly, so the junior crew would not hear. I know, Zelvorn said, equally quietly. The file says Class 3. I know. The file was written. Brix checked the metadata. 62 years ago. Last updated 41 years ago. Zelvorn said nothing. In 41 years, Brix said, they went from the power output in this file to what we're reading now. Zelvorn said nothing. Brix thought about what 41 years of that development rate looked like on a curve, projected forward. He thought about the military satellites. He thought about the tight beam signal that had found them before they finished counting moons. He thought about the fact that he was on a broken ship that needed parts, and this was the closest available source of anything. We should still make contact, he said. We need the repairs. Yes, Zelvorn said, we do. He did not sound happy about it, which was fair, because he was not. He was a practical man, and the practical reality was that the endless patience needed parts, and this planet was where parts might be found. The fact that the planet had turned out to be somewhat more than advertised was a problem for later. The hull integrity was a problem for now. He authorized a response to the tight beam signal. Basic galactic standard, short, formal, the kind of transmission that collective protocol dictated for first contact with pre-warp civilizations. Clear, slow, non-threatening, using the mathematical foundation sequences that any civilization with basic astronomy would eventually decode. The translation engine sent it. They waited. 40 seconds. The distance was not the issue. The signal lag at this range was negligible. The wait was something else. Then a response came back. Not in mathematical sequences. In galactic standard. Broken, accented in a way the translator had to work at. Structured with the grammar of someone who had learned the language from recordings rather than speakers. But galactic standard. Actual words, in order, carrying meaning. The translation engine put it on screen. This is Dr. Sarah Okafor, SETI Observatory, Kenya, Earth. We received your signal. Please confirm. Are you experiencing a technical emergency? Your entry vector and deceleration pattern suggest possible vessel distress. We are prepared to assist if needed. Please repeat transmission at slower rate if communication is difficult. We have been working on this translation for some time, and would prefer not to waste it. Zelvorn read it 3 times. The bridge was very quiet. Brix read it, and felt something move in his chest that was not a physical sensation, more like a recalibration, like a sensor array that had been pointed at the wrong target for a long time, suddenly finding the right one. We have been working on this translation for some time. How long, he wanted to ask. He did not ask. He stood on the bridge of a broken ship orbiting a planet that had been watching them since the asteroid belt, and he thought about a person sitting somewhere on that planet, at a desk, under artificial light, in the middle of a night shift, holding something warm to drink probably, having spent years learning to say hello, in a language she had never heard spoken, and he thought about what kind of person did that. What kind of civilization produced that person? What kind of civilization pointed that person at a radio antenna and told her to wait? Zell drafted the response himself. He kept it short. He confirmed distress. He confirmed peaceful intent. He requested communication channel establishment for repair negotiation purposes. He sent it. The response came back in 40 seconds. Understood. Channel established. I am going to need approximately 11 minutes before I can continue this conversation. I have some calls to make. Please hold. A pause. Then, appended at the bottom, in slightly different formatting, like a thought added after. Also, welcome to Earth. Zell stared at that last line for a long time. Brix read it and said nothing, but one corner of his face did something that on a human might have been called a smile. It was involuntary. He was fairly sure Zell did not notice. The endless patience held its orbit, slowly, carefully, hull integrity at 58% and holding, above a planet that had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment, and had used the waiting time well. Below them, on the dark side of the Terminator line, a continent called Africa caught the first edge of dawn. Somewhere in that light, a woman named Sarah Okafor put down her headset, picked up her phone, and began making calls. 11 minutes, she had said. Zell set a timer. He did not know why. He just wanted to see if she was accurate. She was accurate to within 4 seconds. He was already beginning to find this planet exhausting, and he had not yet landed on it. The 11 minutes went like this. Okafor called her supervisor, Dr. Mensah, who did not answer because it was 3 a.m. in Accra, and Dr. Mensah was a man who believed deeply in sleep. She left a voicemail that said, in a tone of remarkable calm, that she had established two-way communication with an extraterrestrial vessel in low Earth orbit, and that the vessel appeared to be in distress, and that she was going to need some guidance on next steps when he had a moment. She ended the voicemail, reconsidered, called back and added, I don't think this can wait until morning, actually. I'm sorry. Then she called the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs emergency line, which existed for exactly this scenario, and which, in 40 years of existence, had never been called for exactly this scenario. The officer on duty, a young man in Vienna named Gerhard, who had taken the overnight shift because he had a dentist appointment the next morning and thought this would be a quiet night, answered on the second ring. Okafor told him what she had. There was a silence of approximately 6 seconds, which she later described as the sound of a man deciding whether he was actually awake. Gerhard was awake. He began making his own calls. By minute 7, the chain had reached a length and a temperature that Okafor could track simply by watching how fast her phone filled with incoming calls from numbers she did not recognize. By minute 9, someone in the chain had done something that caused a very specific kind of encrypted signal to go out to 17 locations simultaneously, and she knew this because her station's own monitoring equipment flagged the signal type, military priority, highest tier. She had not made that call. Someone above Gerhard had. By minute 10, she had 14 open lines on hold, including 3 she was fairly certain were heads of state or their direct staff, and she was suddenly and viscerally aware that she was wearing a shirt with a coffee stain on the left cuff and had not slept in 19 hours. At minute 11, she picked up her headset and called the ship back. She was 4 seconds late and did not apologize for it, because she had been busy. On the endless patience. Zell noted the 4-second variance and said nothing about it. He was not a petty man, and there were more important things to think about, including the fact that in the 11 minutes they had waited, 3 new objects had appeared in the planet's orbital band. Not suddenly, they had been there before, in higher orbits. They had repositioned. He knew what repositioning looked like. He noted it in the log. He did not mention it to the crew because the crew had enough to think about. He mentioned it to Brix privately because Brix was the kind of officer who needed to know things in order to be useful, and was the kind of officer who would find out anyway. Brix looked at the repositioned objects, looked at their new orbital inclinations, looked at the arcs they now covered. They have a firing solution on us, he said. They are not targeting us, Zell said. Targeting would look different. They are, Aware of us. They want us to know they are aware of us. Brix thought about the distinction. It was a real distinction. It mattered. A gun pointed at you was different from a gun held by someone who had stepped into the same room as you. Different posture, different intent. That's a very sophisticated thing to do, he said. Yes, Zellvorn said. They did not say anything else about it. The channel opened, and Dr. Okafor's voice came through, and they had other things to focus on. The conversation lasted 4 hours. This was longer than standard first contact protocols recommended. The collective's guidelines suggested initial contact be kept to 30 minutes maximum to avoid overwhelming a pre-warp civilization's psychological and political systems, but the collective's guidelines had been written for a different kind of pre-warp civilization. They had been written for civilizations that, upon receiving contact, required time to absorb the fact that they were not alone in the universe. Okafor did not require this time. She had spent her career being certain they were not alone. What she required was information, and she gathered it with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation in various forms for 20 years and was now, finally, running the real version. She confirmed their vessel type, their origin system, the nature of their distress. She asked about the collective, what it was, how many member species, what its structure was, in a tone that was curious but not awed, the way a person might ask about an organization they had heard of but not yet joined. Zellvorn answered carefully. The collective's protocol for pre-warp civilizations recommended limited information sharing, enough to establish communication, not enough to cause cultural disruption. He gave her the framework, the broad shape. He did not give her the details. She asked follow-up questions that suggested she had already derived several of the details from the framework. He gave her slightly more detail. She asked follow-up questions that suggested she had derived the rest. Brix, listening from the engineering station, made a note in his personal log. Initial assessment. These people are fast. By hour 2, the conversation had moved to the repair situation. Zellvorn gave Brix the comm lead, and Brix gave Okafor the parts list. He was not optimistic. He was prepared to be polite about the planet not having what he needed, which was a professional courtesy he extended to Class 3 civilizations, the same way you might express condolences for something that was genuinely no one's fault. Okafor put him on a brief hold. When she came back, she had someone else on the line, a man whose voice had the particular flatness of someone who was very competent and very tired and saw no reason to perform otherwise. His name was Captain Adeyemi. He was, she explained, the ground liaison who would be handling the practical side of things from the human end. He was, she did not explain but which became clear, also military, which explained the flatness. Adeyemi asked Brix to read the parts list again, slowly. Brix read it. He was precise. He used the collective's technical nomenclature, which the translation unit rendered into what he assumed were rough equivalents. There was a pause after each item, not the pause of incomprehension. The pause of a man running a mental checklist. The manifold core, Adeyemi said. Walk me through the function. Brix walked him through it. Adeyemi asked 3 follow-up questions that were, technically speaking, excellent questions. The third one made Brix stop mid-sentence and reconsider his answer. You're describing something like a plasma containment system, Adeyemi said. In very basic terms, yes, Brix said. We have those. Brix had been about to say, I very much doubt that, but he did not say it, because something in Adeyemi's voice suggested that doubt would be wasted. What grade? He asked instead. Adeyemi said he would need to make some more calls. He would have an answer within an hour. He had an answer in 38 minutes. The answer was not, we don't have anything like that. The answer was a technical specification, read aloud by someone else. A different voice, younger, faster, with the cadence of someone reading from a document they had authored themselves. And the specification was not identical to what Brix needed, but it was not primitive either. It was, in engineering terms, adjacent. The same principle approached from a different direction. The same mountain climbed from the other side. Brix listened. He did not interrupt. When the voice finished, he sat very still for a moment that was slightly too long, and then he said, Can you send me that in writing? It was not phrased as a question. The specification arrived in text format 40 seconds later. Brix read it again, looked up at the ceiling of the engineering station for no functional reason, looked back at the specification. Zelvorn, he said, on the private channel. Yes. Their plasma containment specification. It's not the same as ours. You said that. You said it was incompatible. I said it wasn't the same. Those are different statements. Brix looked at the document. The underlying mathematics is the same. The engineering implementation is different. The way they arrived at the solution is, he paused. There was a word he wanted to use, and it was not a word he used often, because it was the kind of word that, once you used it about a Class 3 civilization, meant the file was wrong, and everything that followed from the file was also wrong. It's elegant, he said. It's a different kind of elegant, but it's still elegant. Zelvorn did not respond immediately. They reinvented it, Brix said, without any contact with collective science. They looked at the same physics we looked at, and they came out somewhere else that still works. Does it help us? Zelvorn asked. He was a practical man. I don't know yet. Possibly. With modification. Brix set the document down. But that's not the point I'm making. I know what point you're making, Zelvorn said. Note it in the log. We will discuss it later. Brix noted it in the log. He flagged it high priority. He suspected Zelvorn would defer the discussion indefinitely, because Zelvorn was a practical man, and the practical path was to get the repairs done and leave, and thinking too carefully about what the specification implied about the planet they were orbiting made the practical path more complicated. Brix thought about it anyway. The UN First Contact Protocol activated at hour 3. Okafor knew it was coming. She had triggered the notification herself, in minute 7 of the 11. She had known, triggering it, that it would activate in approximately 3 hours. The protocol had an intentional delay built in, a cooling period, a space for initial contact to stabilize before the machinery of international response descended on it. The cooling period had been useful. She had learned a great deal in 3 hours. The protocol activating meant her 14 held lines all became active simultaneously, which meant the next 40 minutes were the most complicated of her professional life, and also, she reflected, quite funny in the way that things were funny when they were happening to you specifically, and would be funny to other people forever afterward. The UN Secretary-General's office wanted a full briefing. The African Union wanted a full briefing. The United States Space Command wanted a full briefing. The European Space Agency wanted a full briefing. The Russian Space Agency wanted a full briefing, and used slightly more forceful language about wanting it. China's National Space Administration said it had already been briefed, which was either true or a claim designed to position them as more informed than they were, and either way, she did not have time to determine which. Gerhard from Vienna called back to apologize for the number of calls she was receiving, and to confirm that yes, he had been the one to trigger the military priority signal, and yes, he was very sorry. He had thought it was the right call, and she told him it was absolutely the right call, and he sounded grateful enough that she felt bad she did not have more time to reassure him. She kept one line open to the ship throughout. Brix, who had taken over the technical comm channel, stayed on. She appreciated this. It was grounding somehow, the alien engineer's steady, slightly formal voice in one ear, while the entire organized apparatus of human civilization tried to crowd into the other. She briefed everyone as efficiently as possible. Distressed vessel, non-hostile, requested repairs and landing permission. No threat assessment from any monitoring source so far. This she confirmed with Adeyemi, who confirmed it in the flat tone that meant he had checked 3 times. The question of landing permission triggered a debate that was, by any measure, spectacular in its commitment to process. 14 governments in real-time conference, each with their own concerns, each with their own protocols, each with a slightly different interpretation of what the relevant international agreements actually said about this scenario, which was understandable because the relevant international agreements had been written by people who privately did not expect to need them and had left the language looser than they should have. Okafor muted most of the lines and talked to Adeyemi. How long do they have? She asked. She meant the ship. 48 hours of stable orbit, maybe. After that, the hull situation gets unpredictable. Brix said 48, but his voice did the thing where the number is optimistic. Okafor understood the thing where the number was optimistic. She had a number like that herself sometimes. The UN needs 72 hours to approve landing. I know. That's a problem. I know. Adeyemi was quiet for a moment. She could hear in the background the particular quality of sound that meant he was in a vehicle. She pictured him driving somewhere in the dark. She did not know where yet, but she had a feeling she would find out. I'm going to come to you, he said. I'm in Nairobi. 4 hours. You don't need to. Someone needs to be there who can make a decision without 14 conference calls. His voice was not impatient, just precise. That person is going to be me. Make sure there's coffee. He ended the call. Okafor looked at the coffee machine in the corner of the station monitoring room. It was a standard office machine, the kind that produced something technically classifiable as coffee, but which she usually supplemented with the thermos she brought from home. She looked at the thermos. She looked at the machine. She started a second pot. Adeyemi arrived at the SETI station in a Land Rover with a government plate, a sidearm he wore with the practiced invisibility of someone who had long since stopped noticing it, and a thermos of his own that smelled, when he opened it, like something Okafor recognized as the very good kind. He shook her hand, looked at the monitoring equipment, looked at the screens showing the ship's orbital track, looked at the secondary display showing the repositioned satellites and their current angles. Good positioning, he said, which was not a compliment she had arranged. Someone above me did that, she said. I know who. He sat down, poured from his thermos into the station's spare mug without asking, and looked at the comm display. Is Brix still on? Monitoring channel, yes. Adeyemi leaned toward the comm. Brix, this is Captain Adeyemi. I'm the ground liaison. I'm going to be your main point of contact on the practical side. Brix's voice came back after a 2-second processing lag that had nothing to do with signal delay. Understood, Captain. We have a timing problem. I know, 48 hours versus 72. Yes. Adeyemi drank his coffee, set the mug down. Here is what I can do. I cannot approve landing authorization. That goes through the UN process, and the process is the process. What I can do is get you a provisional agreement in 36 hours instead of 72, if I make some calls to the right people in the right order. What does provisional mean? It means I put my name on it, and it holds until the full authorization catches up, which it will. A pause, longer than signal delay. That is an unusual amount of personal authority for a ground liaison, Brix said. It's an unusual situation, Adeyemi said. Another pause. Then, with what Okafor could only describe as the verbal equivalent of a nod, acceptable. Thank you. Adeyemi began making calls. He made them in a specific order, with specific language, in 3 different languages depending on who he was calling, and Okafor watched him work with the appreciation of someone who recognized a skilled person operating at full capacity. She translated. She answered technical questions. She relayed information between Brix and the various human agencies, simultaneously assembling their responses. She did not sleep. She did not particularly want to. At some point, she thought it was around hour 5, or maybe 6. The night was getting unclear around its edges. Brix said something that stopped her mid-sentence. He said, Dr. Okafor, can I ask you a question that is not about the repairs? Yes, she said. The file we have on your planet, the collective's classification record. It describes your civilization as Class 3, early orbital capability, basic tool use. The file is 41 years old. I know, she said. We intercepted it. Silence. Not processing lag. Actual silence. You intercepted our classification file, Brix said. We intercepted a lot of your transmissions over the years. We've been listening for a long time. She paused. We didn't know what most of it meant until we built better translation models, but we kept everything. Another silence. Longer. How much? Brix said, and then stopped, and started again. How much of the collective's communication architecture do you have records of? Okafor smiled, though he could not see it. That, she said, is probably a conversation for the negotiating table. Adeyemi, across the room, looked up from his call and met her eyes. He had heard. He gave a small nod, the kind that meant Good answer. And went back to his call. Outside, the dawn was starting for real now, the sky going from black to the particular deep blue that came just before color returned to the world. The ship tracked across the brightening sky on the monitoring display, its orbit slow and careful, hull integrity holding at 57%, which was not comfortable, but was stable. 36 hours, Adeyemi had said. He was already ahead of schedule. Brix was quiet on the line. Okafor let the quiet sit. She had a feeling he was doing the same math she was, working backward from. We've been listening for a long time to what that implied about the conversation they were about to have, about what Earth had and what Earth knew, and what the file had gotten wrong. It had gotten a lot wrong. On the orbital track display, the 3 repositioned military satellites held their angles with patient, steady precision. Gerhard from Vienna sent an email asking if she needed anything. She wrote back, "We're fine, get some sleep." She refilled her mug. She had stopped keeping track of how many that was. The number was not useful information. She put her headset back on and waited for the next question. She was good at waiting. She had been doing it for a very long time. The shuttle landed on a beach. This was not the original plan. The original plan had involved a designated flat surface inland, pre-cleared, with a 2-kilometer exclusion zone and a formal reception area that several governments had spent 11 hours arguing about. The exclusion zone had been agreed upon. The reception area had been agreed upon. The location had been agreed upon by 12 of the 14 relevant parties, with 2 abstaining on procedural grounds rather than substantive ones, which Adeyemi had explained to Okafor meant they agreed, but wanted it on record that they had reservations. Then Brix had looked at the proposed landing site on the coordinates they sent him, and pointed out that the shuttle's landing gear was not designed for compacted soil, and that if the site was not bedrock or equivalent hardness, they risked a strut collapse on touchdown, which would be embarrassing for everyone. Adeyemi had driven the length of the Nigerian coast for 4 hours the previous night. He knew a beach. The beach was flat. The beach was sand over a limestone shelf. The beach was, he said, hard enough. Brix confirmed the geology from orbit. The beach was hard enough. So the shuttle landed on a beach in the early morning, with the Atlantic on one side and a line of military vehicles at a respectful distance on the other. And the Nigerian Air Force had a perimeter up that was professional enough that you had to look for it to know it was there. And the Indian Ocean was doing what the Indian Ocean did in the morning, which was shine. Okafor stood at the front of the reception party. She had slept for 3 hours, changed her shirt, and was holding a tablet that contained everything she thought she might need. Adeyemi stood beside her in uniform, thermos in hand, watching the shuttle's landing sequence with the expression of a man cataloging information without passing judgment on it yet. The shuttle was not what either of them had expected. They had both, privately, imagined something sleek, the cinema version of alien engineering. What came down instead was functional in the way that working tools are functional, designed around what it needed to do, rather than how it needed to look. It was roughly the size of a large military transport. Its hull had the texture of something that had been repaired before, several times. It landed with a heaviness that suggested mass rather than elegance, and its landing struts found the limestone shelf and held, which was all anyone needed from them. The ramp came down. Brix was first. He was taller than the file's species profile had suggested. The profile was 41 years old, Okafor reminded herself. It was wrong about most things, and broader across the upper body than the profile's illustrations, with a face that was not quite bilaterally symmetrical in the way that human faces were, which the human brain kept trying to correct for and kept failing. He wore what appeared to be a working uniform, practical, worn in the right places, with a tool harness across one shoulder that held equipment she could not yet name. He came down the ramp, and he stopped at the bottom, and he looked at the beach, and then at the ocean, and then at the sky, and then at Okafor. She said in Galactic Standard, "Good morning." He said, in Galactic Standard, with the accent of someone who had been listening to her speak it for 30 hours. "Good morning, Dr. Okafor." The 4 engineers behind him came down the ramp. They fanned out slightly, not aggressively, just with the instinct of people who were used to needing room to work. They had tool cases. They had equipment. They looked at the human reception party with the careful, measuring expressions of people who had been told to expect a Class 3 civilization and were already revising that expectation. Adeyemi stepped forward and introduced himself. He did not extend his hand, because they had not established whether that gesture translated, and he was a man who did not do things without knowing what they meant. Brix looked at him, looked at the thermos. "Captain Adeyemi, you are the one who arranged the ground." "The beach was practical," Adeyemi said. "Yes," Brix said. "It was." A pause, not uncomfortable. The kind of pause that two practical people share when they have recognized each other as practical and do not need to say so. "Shall we look at the problem?" Adeyemi said. "Yes," Brix said. "Let's look at the problem." The engineering team had set up a field station 200 meters from the landing site, a series of portable structures that contained analysis equipment, a fabrication unit, and, because Adeyemi had arranged it, a folding table with coffee and water and food, the last of which the Vorkai engineers regarded with polite uncertainty and did not touch. The coffee they also did not touch. Yet. What they did touch, immediately and with focus, was the component manifest that the human engineering team had assembled overnight. There were 6 humans on the technical side, 3 from the Nigerian Space Research and Development Agency, 2 on secondment from the European Space Agency, and 1 from an Indian private aerospace company whose name Okafor could not pronounce correctly no matter how many times she tried. They had worked through the night on Brix's parts list, pulling from every accessible technical inventory, translating specifications, identifying candidates. Their team lead was a woman named Dr. Funmi Adediji, who was 34 and had completed her doctorate on advanced materials for spacecraft shielding, and had the specific kind of restless energy that came from someone who had spent a career preparing for a problem and had just been handed the exact problem. She handed Brix a physical folder. He looked at it. He looked at her. He opened it. The folder contained specification sheets, material samples in sealed bags, and 3 pages of notes written in a mixture of English and mathematical notation. The mathematical notation was clear. The English was dense and fast and assumed familiarity. Brix read through it. The 4 engineers behind him read through copies. Nobody spoke. The first item was the aerogel compound. The Vorkai used a hull sealing compound for emergency breach repair, a fast-setting material that bonded to most hull alloys and held against vacuum. Brix had a limited supply on board. What the spec sheet described was different in chemistry, but similar in structure. A silica-based aerogel, modified with polymer reinforcement, developed originally for Earth spacecraft thermal insulation, and adapted over the past decade for emergency structural applications. The density was lower than the Vorkai compound. The bonding mechanism was different. Adediji watched him read it. "The density worried us too," she said, without waiting for him to raise it. "We ran pressure tests at vacuum equivalent. The bonding mechanism distributes load differently than a standard adhesive. You get broader surface contact at lower material weight. It actually performs better under lateral shear than your compound spec suggests." Brix looked up. "You have our compound spec. You transmitted your parts list." The spec was in the header data. He had transmitted the parts list. The spec had been in the header data. He had not thought about that because Class 3 civilizations did not typically read header data. They typically did not have the translation capacity for it. "The lateral shear performance data," he said. She pulled another sheet from the folder and handed it to him. He read it. His face did the thing that Okafor, watching from the edge of the group, was starting to learn to read. A particular stillness that meant he had encountered something he needed to recalculate around. "We'd like to test it on a sample hull section before committing to the breach," she said. "We brought test panels that match your hull alloy composition. Approximately. We estimated from the spectral analysis of your entry burn." Brix set the sheet down. "You analyzed our hull composition from our entry burn. Atmospheric entry produces a characteristic emission spectrum. Yours was unusual. We hadn't seen that alloy before. But the spectrometer data was clean." She said it the way you said things that were obvious in retrospect. "We can adjust the aerogel formulation if the bond test is weak." One of the Vorkai engineers said something to Brix in their own language. Brix responded briefly. The engineer looked at the human team with an expression Okafor could not read yet, but filed for later. "Run the bond test," Brix said. The bond test took 40 minutes. It held. It held better than the Vorkai compound on the sample panel, which Brix noted in his log without comment, because the comment would have taken more time than he had. The coolant fluid was easier. Human industrial coolant was not a match, but it was adaptable. The human engineers had already done the adaptation calculations overnight and had 2 drums of modified compound ready. Brix tested it. It was within tolerance. The manifold core was the hard problem. It was always going to be the hard problem. There was no human equivalent, not directly. What Adediji had brought instead was the plasma containment unit that Adeyemi had described over the phone, a magnetic confinement ring developed by the Indian Aerospace Company for use in experimental propulsion research. It was not a manifold core. It could not be a manifold core without significant modification. Brix sat with it for 2 hours. His 4 engineers sat with it too. They pulled it apart, measured it, ran compatibility checks against the endless patiences. Systems. They had a long discussion in their own language that Okafor did not follow but watched the body language of, the gestures that meant disagreement, the gestures that meant concession, the gestures that meant, "I don't like this, but I cannot find the flaw in your reasoning." Adediji sat across from them with her own team. She did not interrupt. She watched them work, and when they looked at something, and then looked at each other, she said, quietly to her team, "Write down what they're examining, in order." Her team wrote it down, in order. At the 2-hour mark, Brix looked up and said, "If we reroute the primary induction pathway through this unit, using it as a temporary confinement bridge rather than a core replacement, we can achieve approximately 60% fold efficiency. Enough for 2 or 3 jumps. Enough to reach a collective station. 60%, one of his engineers said, in collective standard, not directing it at anyone. 60% is functional," Brix said. Adediji cleared her throat. Brix looked at her. She turned her tablet around. On it was a schematic. It was clearly derived from the plasma containment unit, but it had modifications, additional components, a rerouting architecture, annotations in English, and mathematics. "If you add a secondary magnetic coil here," she pointed, "and reroute through it before the induction pathway, you get better field coherence. The confinement is more stable. Our simulations put efficiency closer to 78%. Brix looked at the schematic. He said, "Where did this come from?" "We worked on it last night," she said. "After you sent the parts list, we knew the manifold was the problem. We didn't have a solution, but we thought," she paused, found the right words, "we thought it was worth trying to think about it." Brix looked at the schematic for a long time. He looked at the secondary coil placement. He looked at the rerouting architecture. He looked at the mathematics in the annotation, which was correct. "This will work," he said. "We thought it would." "You derived this without knowing our system architecture. We derived it from the parts list you sent, the header data, and some reasonable assumptions about how a fold drive manifold would need to manage magnetic field coherence based on general physics." She said it evenly. "We might have gotten lucky." "You did not get lucky," Brix said. "The physics is correct. The implementation is..." He paused. "It's not how we would have done it." "No," she said. "Probably not. It is better than how we would have done it." The beach was quiet for a moment except for the ocean, which was not quiet, but was consistent enough that it functioned as quiet. "Thank you," Brix said. He said it in galactic standard. Then he appeared to decide that was insufficient, and said it again in English, which he had been absorbing from the translation unit's feed for 30 hours, and the English came out accented and careful but correct. Adediji said, "You're welcome," in the same tone she would have used with any colleague. They got to work. The work took 14 hours. In those 14 hours, the aerogel compound was applied to the hull breach in sections, each one bond tested before the next was laid, and the bond held at every section, and at the last section held at a rating 20% above the Vorkai compound's standard spec. The coolant lines were drained and refilled. The modified human compound circulated. The temperature readings stabilized in 11 minutes. which was 4 minutes faster than standard refill protocol, because the human compound had a slightly better thermal conductivity coefficient. Nobody said anything about this. Brix noted it in the log. The plasma containment unit was modified according to Adediji's schematic, with 2 additional modifications suggested by Brix's engineers during installation that Adediji's team flagged as improvements and immediately wrote down. The unit was fitted. The induction pathway was rerouted. The secondary coil was positioned. Brix ran diagnostics. The manifold bridge held. Field coherence was stable. Efficiency reading, 79.3%. 1.3 above Adediji's simulation. The additional modifications had been good modifications. He ran the diagnostic again because the number seemed too good. The number came back the same. He stood in the middle of the field station, surrounded by human and Vorkai engineers, who were all looking at the same diagnostic readout on different screens, and he felt something he had not expected to feel on this planet. He felt outclassed, not threatened, not diminished. The sensation was more precise than that. It was the specific feeling of an expert encountering another expert in the same field, who had arrived at expertise by a completely different path, and the encounter expanding your understanding of what expertise could mean. He had come here to strip usable parts from a primitive world. He had left with a better ship than he arrived with. He turned to look for Adeyemi, who had spent the 14 hours moving between the engineering work and a series of comm calls that he conducted at a distance from the group, with a quietness that Brix had noted but not investigated. He found the captain standing at the edge of the field station, on the phone, with his back to the ocean. Adeyemi finished his call, turned around, looked at Brix. "Done?" he asked. "Done," Brix said. "Better than done." Adeyemi nodded. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had suspected this outcome and was confirming the suspicion. "Commander Zelvorn called down while you were working," he said. "He received a communication from your council." "About the repairs?" "About us." Adeyemi's voice had not changed. It was still flat, still precise, still the voice of a competent man who saw no reason to perform. "He wants a face-to-face meeting. We're setting it up for tomorrow morning." "What kind of communication did the council send?" Brix asked. Adeyemi looked at him for a moment, just looked at him, with the evaluating patience of someone who was deciding how much to say. "The kind," he said, "that makes a face-to-face meeting necessary." He poured from his thermos. He held the mug out to Brix. It was not the first time he had offered. It was the first time Brix had held the mug long enough to actually look at what was inside it. The liquid was dark. It steamed slightly in the morning air. The smell was nothing Brix had encountered before, complex in a way that was not immediately categorizable, bitter and warm, and something underneath both of those things that he did not have a word for. "What is it?" he said. "Coffee," Adeyemi said. Brix held the mug. He did not drink from it, but he held it. Something about the warmth of it in his hands was unexpectedly grounding after 14 hours of work, which he would not have predicted and did not know what to do with. Adeyemi looked out at the ocean. "My grandmother used to say," he said, in a tone that was not aimed at anyone, "that you could tell a lot about a person by whether they showed up ready to work." He glanced at the Vorkai engineers, who were packing equipment alongside the human engineers with the easy efficiency of people who had been working together for half a day and had found a rhythm. He glanced back at the ocean. "Your people showed up ready to work," he said. "That means something." Brix looked at the mug in his hands, at the steam rising from it. He thought about the diagnostic. 79.3. A ship running better than it had before the damage. He thought about Adediji's schematic, derived overnight from a parts list and reasonable assumptions. He thought about the council's communication, which he had not yet read but which Zelvorn's voice, when he mentioned it, had carried a particular quality that Brix recognized. The quality of a man who had received an instruction he did not like from a source he could not refuse. Not yet, anyway. He thought about 47 protectorates, and what that number meant to the 47 planets underneath it, and what it would have meant to this beach if the file had been accurate and the ship had been fine and they had never needed to land. He looked at the human engineers loading equipment into vehicles, at Adediji making notes on her tablet, at Okafor, who had been awake for something close to 40 hours and showed it only in the particular economy of her movements. Everything deliberate, nothing wasted. He had come here to extract. He was leaving with more than he brought. The mug was warm. The coffee smell was complex. He still did not drink it, but he held it all the way back to the shuttle, and he did not give it back, and Adeyemi did not ask for it. In orbit above them, the endless patience ran its own diagnostics on the incoming repair data and returned, for the first time since the manifold cracked, a green status across all primary systems. Zelvorn looked at the green status. He should have felt relief. He felt relief and something else underneath it, a weight that was not the ship's weight, but his own, settling around the message from the council that sat unopened in his queue. He opened it. He read it. He sat with it for a long time. Then he opened a channel to Adeyemi and requested the meeting. The tent was Adeyemi's idea. Not a conference room, not a government building, not anything that belonged to any one nation's territory or implied any one nation's authority. A tent, large enough for 2 delegations and a table, small enough that everyone in it would have to look at each other. Neutral ground at the edge of the beach, with the Atlantic doing its indifferent business 50 meters away, and the morning coming in flat and silver off the water. Adeyemi had requisitioned the tent from the Nigerian Army Logistics Depot at 4 in the morning, and had it erected by 6. He had also requisitioned folding chairs, a portable power unit, 1 translation relay terminal, and a folding table. On the table he placed 2 things, the translation terminal and a thermos of coffee with 2 mugs beside it. His aide had looked at the 2 mugs, and then at him. "They might not drink it," she said. "That's fine," he said. "It's not there for them to drink." She had not asked what it was there for, because she had worked with him long enough to understand that some of his decisions explained themselves in time. Zelvorn came down in the shuttle himself. This was a change from the previous day, when he had stayed in orbit and managed everything through bricks, and Okafor noted it. A commander leaving the ship with a compromised hull was a statement. She wrote it in the margin of her tablet notes. He is taking this seriously enough to come himself. He came down with bricks, 2 security officers whose body language said military without saying anything else, and a document case that he carried himself rather than delegating. The document case was also a statement. Okafor wrote that down too. They crossed the beach to the tent. The morning was warm already. The Nigerian coast in this season was not subtle about warmth, and Zelvorn looked at the sky with the expression of someone whose planet had a different relationship with its sun and was recalibrating. Brix looked at the ocean. He had been looking at the ocean every chance he got since landing. Okafor had the impression that his planet did not have one. The human delegation was already inside. General Marcus Hale had arrived overnight, flown in from U.S. Space Command via a route that had been kept quiet enough that Okafor only learned about it when he walked into the SETI station at 2 in the morning, introduced himself with the brevity of a man who assumed his name was already known, and sat down with Adeyemi's files without being asked. He was 61. He had the build of someone who had once been physically large and had redistributed that presence into stillness. He did not gesture when he talked. He did not need to. He sat at the table, and the table felt like it was his table, which was a quality that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with preparation. Beside him, Okafor, with her tablet. Beside her, Adeyemi, with his thermos. At the far end of the table, 1 UN observer named Liu Wei, who had been on a plane from Geneva since midnight and had the specific exhaustion of someone who had slept sitting up and was not complaining about it. The Vorkai delegation sat across from them. Zelvorn in the center, Brix to his left. The 2 security officers flanked without hovering. The document case went on the table in front of Zelvorn. Adeyemi poured coffee into 1 mug. He set it in the center of the table. He left the second mug empty beside the thermos. Nobody said anything about the coffee. Not yet. Zelvorn opened. He had a formal manner that Okafor had not seen in 30-plus hours of communication with Brix. A register shift, a deliberate adoption of the cadence that collective protocols used for official engagements. She adjusted her translation accordingly. He presented the collective's position. He did it cleanly, without preamble, which she respected. The collective had become aware of Earth. He used the planet's name, she noted, which was a concession to their communication, rather than the file's designation. and wished to formalize the relationship. The collective offered its standard framework for newly contacted civilizations, the Protectorate Agreement. He laid the document on the table. Hale did not reach for it immediately. He let it sit for 3 seconds, which was long enough to be deliberate and short enough to be polite. Then he picked it up and read it. He read slowly, not because he was a slow reader, because he was a thorough one. Okafor watched Zelvorn watch Hale read. She watched the security officers, who were watching the tent entrance. She watched Brix, who was watching the document with an expression she had learned to read over the past day and a half. The expression that meant he already knew what was in it, and had already done the math, and was waiting to see if the humans would do the same math. She thought they would. Hale reached the 3rd page. He read it at the same pace he had read everything else, which was admirable, because the 3rd page was where the military limitation clause lived. He set the document down. He aligned it with the edge of the table, which was the kind of small, precise action that some people did when they needed a moment without appearing to need one. Adeyemi poured coffee into the 2nd mug and slid it toward Zelvorn. Zelvorn looked at the mug. He had held Brix's mug on the beach yesterday. Brix had mentioned it, briefly, in his overnight log, but he had not drunk from it. He picked this one up, because putting it down felt like a statement he did not intend to make, and he held it the same way Brix had described. Both hands, steam rising, the smell complex and unfamiliar, and not unpleasant. Hale looked up from the document. "How many civilizations have signed this agreement?" he asked. 47, Zelvorn said. "That's a significant number. The collective has been operating for 300 years. The pace of contact increases as member worlds expand survey range." Hale nodded. He picked up the document again, found a specific page, found a specific line. "This clause," he said. He read it aloud in the translation unit's rendering, the clause that limited signatory civilizations from developing military capability beyond a specified threshold without collective approval. He read it neutrally, without inflection, the way you read something when you want the words to carry their own weight, rather than any weight you add to them. He set the document down again. "Of the 47 signatories," he said, "how many retained full sovereignty over their own military development?" The tent was quiet. The ocean was not, but the ocean was 50 meters away. Zelvorn held the coffee mug. He was a practical man and a careful one, and he understood what the question was actually asking, which was not a request for a statistic. It was a request for honesty, dressed as a request for a statistic. "None," he said. Hale said nothing. He did not need to. He had asked the question that needed to be asked, and received the answer that needed to be heard, and now the answer was in the room with everyone in it. One of the Vorkai security officers shifted his weight. It was a small movement. It was the first movement either of them had made since sitting down. Adeyemi drank his coffee. Okafor slid the counteroffer across the table before Zelvorn could speak again. She did it without announcement, just placed it in the space between the two delegations with the quietness of someone completing a motion they had planned well in advance, which she had. She and Hale had spent 3 hours on it the previous night, with Lu Wei reviewing the legal framework, and Adeyemi reading the final version at 1 in the morning and saying only, "Good, don't change anything." The document was 3 pages. Page 1, Terms. Earth's proposed framework for engagement with the collective. Open trade on agreed goods. Full sovereignty, explicitly stated and not subject to review. No military limitation clauses. No monitoring stations in orbit without Earth's independent consent, revocable on 90 days' notice. Page 2. A summary of Earth's current technological and military capacity. It was not boastful. It was precise. It listed capabilities in the measured language of a technical brief, without editorializing, without threat. It did not need to editorialize. The numbers did what numbers do when they are accurate and unexpected. Page 3. What Earth wanted from the collective. Open trade, full sovereignty, no limitation clauses, and one more thing, a formal seat at the Collective Council's table as an independent member, not a protectorate. Not a dependent, a peer. Zelvorn read page 1. His face was still, the particular stillness she had learned to read as recalibration. He turned to page 2. He read it more slowly. The security officers were no longer still. They were not aggressive. Nothing about their posture was aggressive, but they were present in a way they had not been before. Alert, specifically alert, the kind of alertness that is a trained response to a threat assessment update. Brix was reading his copy of page 2. Okafor watched him read it. She watched the point at which he stopped reading, and simply sat with what he had read, not turning the page, just sitting with the numbers. The numbers were real. They had been verified. The human team had been careful not to overstate, and equally careful not to understate, because understating would have been dishonest, and overstating would have been foolish, and neither of those served what they were trying to do. Zellvorn reached page 3. He read the request for a council seat. He set the document down. Across the table, Hale sat with the easy stillness of a man who had said everything he intended to say, and was comfortable waiting. Okafor sat with her tablet. Adeyemi sat with his coffee. Liu Wei sat with his hands folded, which was the posture of a UN observer who was performing neutrality and not finding it difficult, because he was genuinely neutral. The two Vorkai security officers stood up. Not aggressively. They stood the way people stand when a situation has developed beyond the parameters they were briefed on, and they are waiting for instruction. Their hands were not near anything. They were simply standing, which was different from sitting, which was the point. Hale did not move. Adeyemi sipped his coffee and set the mug down. The tent was quiet. Outside, quietly, something had changed. Neither Vorkai security officer would have been able to say what, exactly. There had been no sound, no visible movement, but the quality of the silence outside the tent was different from what it had been an hour ago. Fuller, more populated. They had done their jobs well enough to feel it without seeing it. Shoes. Zellvorn looked at Brix. Brix looked back at him. He did not say anything. He did not need to. They had been working together for 11 years, which in Vorkai terms was long enough that an exchange of looks carried a full sentence. The look Brix gave him now said, "You already know what I think. I already told you what I think when I sent you the diagnostic numbers, 79.3. Zellvorn looked at the document. He looked at the coffee mug in his hands, which he had been holding for 20 minutes, and which was getting cooler in a way that meant he should either drink it or set it down, and he did not set it down. "Who gave you?" he said, carefully, "the collective standard contact protocol." He had been waiting to ask this since Okafor had told Brix they had intercepted transmissions. He had wanted to ask it before the meeting, but he had wanted to ask it here, in this room, where the answer would land in front of everyone. Okafor looked at him without hesitation. "We built it," she said. "We intercepted collective radio transmissions over a period of approximately 60 years. We couldn't translate most of them for a long time. When we could, we began to understand your organizational structure. The contact protocol framework was derivable from how you communicated about other first contact events." Zellvorn processed this. "You derived our contact protocol from transmissions we did not direct at you." "Yes. And built a counteroffer based on it." "We had time to prepare," she said. "We knew contact was coming eventually. We thought it was worth being ready." The tent was quiet again. Zellvorn thought about 47 protectorates. He thought about the file's description of Earth. Low interaction risk, uncontacted reserve, and about the person who had written that description 41 years ago, and what they had based it on, and whether they had ever actually come here. He thought about the endless patience. Running at 79.3% efficiency because of a schematic drawn overnight by a human engineer who had never seen the inside of a fold-drive manifold. He thought about what the Council's message had said. The Council's message had been clear. The Council had detected the contact event. The Council had run a rapid assessment based on the file, the 41-year-old file, and had determined that the situation was manageable. The instruction was standard. Present the protectorate agreement, obtain signature, classify Earth as a new protectorate, depart. If the civilization resisted, note the resistance and return with a larger delegation at a later date. The instruction had been written by people who had read the file and not the diagnostic numbers. Zellvorn set the coffee mug down. He set it down carefully, not dismissively, the way you set down something you have been holding long enough that setting it down is a decision. He picked up the counteroffer. He looked at page 3 again. The request for a council seat. The word used plainly, without apology. He thought about the 47 planets that had never received a counteroffer, that had received the Protectorate Agreement and had signed it because they had not had time to prepare, or had not known to prepare, or had not had a Dr. Okafor running a night shift for 20 years, learning a language nobody had taught her, so that when the moment came she could say, "Welcome to Earth," in Galactic Standard and mean it as a statement of position rather than a greeting. He looked at Hale. Hale was watching him with the patience of a man who had lived long enough to know that some decisions needed to be made at their own pace, and that trying to accelerate them was the only reliable way to get the wrong answer. "I do not have the authority to grant a council seat," Zelvorn said. "That requires a full council vote. The process takes time." "We understand that," Hale said. "I do have the authority to make a field designation, a first contact classification." Hale said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing. "The file classifies Earth as Class 3, Zelvorn said. "Yes," Okafor said. "That classification is incorrect." He said it flatly, without performance. An engineering observation. The same tone Bricks used when a number came back wrong. "Based on observed capability, your civilization should be reclassified. The appropriate designation." He paused. He was doing something precise with the pause, she realized. Not hesitating. Choosing. Would be Class 7. Peer civilization. The tent absorbed this. Liu Wei, at the end of the table, wrote something very small in his notebook. "A Class 7 designation," Okafor said, carefully, "changes what agreements are available to us." "Yes," Zelvorn said. "It does. A Class 7 civilization cannot be offered a protectorate agreement. Peer civilizations negotiate trade and engagement terms independently." He looked at the counteroffer on the table between them. "What you have written here," he touched page 3 with one finger, "is not a request. It is a statement of what peer engagement looks like. It is correct." The security officers looked at each other. Then, very slowly, they sat down. Outside the tent, the quality of the silence shifted again, fuller, in a different direction. The sound of things standing down rather than standing up. Adeyemi looked at the thermos. He looked at Zelvorn. He poured coffee into the mug that Zelvorn had set down and slid it back. Zelvorn looked at the mug. He picked it up. He drank from it. His face did something complicated for a moment. The first moment his face had done something complicated since he sat down, which was a long time to hold a composed expression, and suggested that holding it had cost something. He looked at the mug. He looked at Adeyemi. "This is coffee," he said. "Yes," Adeyemi said. A pause. "It is very bitter," Zelvorn said. "Yes," Adeyemi said. "You get used to it." Zelvorn drank from it again. Okafor suspected this was not because he had immediately gotten used to it, but because he was a practical man, and he had made a decision about the mug, and he was going to see it through. He opened the document case. He produced a single-page form, Collective Standard, a field commander's provisional designation form, used in first contact scenarios when immediate classification was necessary and full council review would follow. He filled it in. He filled it in carefully, in the collective script, and then he slid it across the table. Okafor read it. The classification, Class 7. The designation, Peer Civilization. The recommended status, Independent Engagement Partner, pending council ratification. The last field was a co-signature line. It required a representative of the contacted civilization to acknowledge the designation. Okafor signed it before Hale had finished reading it. Hale looked at her. "You said you'd been preparing for this," she said. He took the form. He read it. He passed it to Liu Wei, who read it, made a note, and passed it back. Hale placed it in front of himself. He picked up a pen, a physical pen, the kind that left a mark on paper, the kind that mattered because paper lasted, and he signed it. He slid it back to Zelvorn. Zelvorn looked at the two signatures beside his own. He put the form back in the document case. He closed the case. He picked up the coffee mug and held it, and across the table, Adeyemi picked up his own mug, and for a moment both of them sat with warm things in their hands in a tent on a beach where something had just happened, that neither of them had entirely planned. Outside, the Atlantic did its indifferent business. The morning was fully arrived now, the silver gone from the water, and the real color coming through. The deep, particular blue of the Gulf of Guinea in full sun, which was a color that did not appear on any Vorkai star chart, and was, Brix thought, looking at it through the tent's open flap, probably worth an entire separate expedition just to study. He did not say this out loud. There would be time for that later. There was, for the first time in this whole complicated situation, a sense that there would be time. The Council's response arrived 6 hours after Zelvorn transmitted the designation form. 6 hours was fast. The signal lag between Earth and the nearest collective relay station was 2 hours each way, which meant the Council had read the form, convened an emergency session, argued, reached a conclusion, and drafted a response in approximately 2 hours. 2 hours was not long for a bureaucratic body that typically took 2 weeks to approve a supply requisition. They were, Zelvorn noted, motivated. He read the response alone in his quarters. He read it twice. The first read was for content. The second was to make sure he had correctly understood the content, because the content was, in the careful, formal language of collective administrative communication, the closest thing to institutional screaming he had encountered in 22 years of collective service. The response contained 4 parts. The first part declared the field designation invalid on procedural grounds. The form required co-signature from a collective council representative, not a field commander acting unilaterally, and Zelvorn did not hold council representative status. Therefore, the designation carried no binding weight. The second part ordered Zelvorn to transmit a formal retraction to the human delegation, clarify that no official designation had been made, and present the standard protectorate agreement for signature, with a 48-hour acceptance window. The third part informed him that upon return to collective space, he would face a formal conduct review for breach of first contact protocol and unauthorized use of Class 7 designation criteria without evidentiary review board approval. The fourth part, the shortest, the last, the one he read 3 times, instructed him to classify Earth as a Class 5 risk pending full assessment, restrict all further communication to observation only, and prepare for immediate departure. He sat with all 4 parts for a while. Outside his quarters, the ship ran at 79.3% efficiency, repaired and improved by people the Council's file had described as primitive. He thought about the form in the document case, the 2 signatures beside his, the pen Hale had used, physical, paper, the kind that mattered. He thought about Okafor signing before Hale had finished reading, because she had been ready for 20 years and did not need to reread what she had already understood. He thought about 47 protectorates. He opened a channel to Brix. Brix was in the engineering bay, running system checks that did not strictly need running, which was a thing he did when he was thinking. The checks were an excuse for his hands to be busy while his mind went elsewhere. His mind had been going elsewhere since the tent. He had read the counteroffer. He had read the designation form. He had sat in the tent and watched Zelvorn hold a cup of coffee for 20 minutes and make a decision that Brix had seen coming from the moment he read Adigi's schematic, because that was the moment he understood what this planet was, and what the file had gotten wrong, and therefore what everything that followed the file had also gotten wrong. 41 years of wrong, maybe longer. The original survey that generated the file was older still. Zelvorn's voice came through the channel, and Brix listened to what he said. He listened to all of it, the Council's response and the 4 parts, and the order to retract, and the conduct review, and the Class 5 risk designation, and the instruction to depart. When Zelvorn finished, Brix said, "What are you going to do?" A pause. Not signal lag. "I'm going to need to check the regulations," Zelvorn said. Brix understood this immediately, because he and Zelvorn had been working together for 11 years, and he knew what it meant when Zelvorn said he was going to check the regulations. It did not mean he did not know the regulations. It meant he was looking for the specific regulation that said what he wanted to do was technically permissible. Article 7, Section 4, Brix said. Field Commander's first contact designation stands pending Council review, if and only if it carries co-signature from a recognized representative of the contacted civilization. A pause. "Liu Wei," Zelvorn said. He is a UN observer. The UN is Earth's primary multilateral governance body. He is, by any reasonable reading, a recognized representative. The Council's reasonable reading may differ from ours. The Council's reasonable reading is going to differ from ours on a lot of things, Bricks said. That is a problem for the conduct review. The regulation says what it says. Another pause. Longer. The Council is also going to question the evidentiary basis for Class 7 designation, Zellvorn said. I made that call on observed capability. They will say observed capability over 30 hours is insufficient basis for peer classification. Bricks looked at his engineering log, at the diagnostic numbers, at the materials assessment, the plasma containment modification, the hull bond ratings, the coolant efficiency data, the ADDG schematic that had sat in his files since yesterday, and that he had read 6 more times since. I have 30 hours of technical documentation, he said. Peer-reviewed would be generous. This is better than peer-reviewed. This is a comparative engineering analysis against collective standards. That will need to be submitted to the review board. I will submit it to the review board. They will convene the review board in approximately 4 months. Then the designation stands for 4 months while they convene it, Bricks said. Article 7, Section 4. The channel was quiet for a moment. The ship's systems ran their cycles. The coolant pumped. The plasma containment held. The repaired hull registered stable at every monitoring point. Bricks, Zellvorn said. Yes. The conduct review will be unpleasant. I know. I will be the one under review, not you. I am your chief engineer and the author of the technical documentation on which the designation was based, Bricks said. They will find a way to include me. I am comfortable with that. A pause. Good, Zellvorn said. And then, after a brief moment, thank you. Bricks went back to his system checks. His hands were busy. His mind was also, for the first time since the manifold cracked, actually somewhere useful. Adeyemi received the message from Okafor at 7 in the morning. He was already awake, because he had not slept, because the kind of night it had been was not compatible with sleep for men who thought the way he thought. He read the message. Council response incoming, Zellvorn requesting call, get Hale. And called Hale, who was also already awake for the same reasons. They convened in the SETI station's main room. Okafor was already there. Liu Wei was there, which surprised Adeyemi slightly. He had assumed the UN observer would have gone to bed by now. Liu Wei had the look of a man who had slept for 2 hours and considered that sufficient, which Adeyemi respected. Zellvorn came through on the comm. He told them about the Council's response. He read them all 4 parts. His voice was the voice of a man who had already made his decision, and was relaying information as a courtesy rather than a consultation. When he finished, Hale said, "What does Article 7, Section 4 say?" Zellvorn told him. Hale looked at Liu Wei. Liu Wei said, carefully, "I was present. I co-signed nothing formally, but I witnessed the signature and recorded it in my official capacity. Whether that constitutes recognized representative status under collective law is a question the Council will have to answer." "A question that takes time to answer," Okafor said. "Considerable time, I would imagine," Liu Wei said, "particularly if the entity seeking clarification were to engage legal counsel and file through appropriate channels." The room was quiet. "The UN has legal counsel," Adeyemi said. "Extensive legal counsel," Liu Wei agreed, "and a particular fondness for appropriate channels." Adeyemi looked at the comm unit. "Zellvorn, your counsel wants you to issue a retraction." "Yes," Zellvorn said. "Are you going to?" The comm was quiet for 3 seconds. "No," Zellvorn said. Nobody in the room said anything. They did not need to. Sometimes the right answer arrived cleanly, and the only appropriate response was to let it stand in the space it had earned. "The conduct review," Hale said. "That's real." "Yes," Zellvorn said. "It is real. Is there anything we can do?" "You cannot make it worse," Zellvorn said, "which means proceeding correctly, documenting everything, filing through appropriate channels, as Mr. Liu suggests, making it very clear, on the record, formally, that this engagement was conducted in good faith by both parties, and that the designation reflects observable reality rather than protocol preference. We can do that. Hale said. I know, Zelvorn said. That is why I am telling you. The endless patience. Lifted off the following morning. Not in emergency or anger. In order. The way things lifted off when the work was done, and the time had come, and there was no reason to linger except that lingering felt appropriate, and there was not time for appropriate. The departure sequence took 3 hours from authorization to orbit, which gave Brix enough time to do what he had been putting off since the tent, and which he was not sure how to do but which felt necessary. He went back to the beach. He came alone. This was perhaps irregular. Standard procedure was not to return to a contact site without authorization and escort, but the beach was not a controlled area. The perimeter had been stood down the previous evening, and he was, technically, still a guest. Guests could walk. The beach in the morning was different from the beach in the afternoon, which had been different from the beach at dawn, and all three of those were different from the beach at night, which he had not seen but which he imagined was different again. This was a thing about the ocean that he had been thinking about since he first saw it, the way the same place kept being different things, depending on the light and the hour and the tide, which was not a thing any body of water on his home planet did, because his home planet's liquid bodies were underground, and therefore always the same temperature, and always the same dark. The ocean did not have this problem. He stood at the edge of the water. The waves came in the way waves came in, without urgency or purpose, just the long, steady mechanical fact of them, one after another, arriving and retreating, and arriving again. The color of the water was the color he had been looking at through the tent's open flap during the meeting, the deep, specific blue of the Gulf of Guinea in full sun, and it was still that color now, and he still did not have a word for it in any language he spoke. He heard footsteps in the sand behind him. Okafor. She was holding 2 cups, the station's mugs, not Adeyemi's better thermos, but the coffee was real. She held one out. He took it. They stood at the edge of the water and he drank the coffee, which he had now had twice, and which was still very bitter, and which he was, possibly, beginning to understand in the way you began to understand things, that required repeated exposure before the point became clear. You're leaving today, she said. It was not a question. Yes, a few hours. The council will make things difficult. Yes, he said, for a while. Will the designation hold? He considered this. It was a real question with a real answer that he did not know yet. The regulations say yes, he said. The council will argue the regulations say something else. Eventually, someone will have to decide which of us is reading the regulations correctly. How long does that take? Longer than the council would like and shorter than they will try to make it. He drank from the cup. Your UN legal team will help, if they engage early. They are engaging now, she said. Liu Wei made calls at 5 this morning. Brix looked at the water. A wave came in and went out, and another came in behind it. The regularity of it was something he found difficult to account for. Not comforting exactly, but substantial, like a fact about the universe that was not going anywhere. I want to come back, he said. Okafor was quiet. Not officially, not on collective business. I want to come back and spend time and look at things. He gestured at the water without quite being able to specify what about it he meant. He meant the color. He meant the sound. He meant the way it kept arriving. There are things here I do not have words for yet. I would like to find the words. You'd be welcome, she said. The council will not approve it. Then come anyway, she said. We'll file the appropriate paperwork on our end. It'll be very thorough. He made the sound that was becoming, he noticed, his version of a laugh. Not identical to a human laugh. Not supposed to be. They stood there a while longer. The waves did what waves did. Eventually, he handed her the empty mug. She took it. They walked back up the beach toward the field station, where his shuttle was running its pre-departure checks and the human engineering team had come out to watch it go, which was the kind of thing that was not in any protocol and did not need to be. Adediji was there. She handed him a sealed data drive as he walked past, a copy of the aerogel data, the plasma containment specs, the coolant modification calculations. For the record, she said. For the record, he said. He put it in his harness. Adeyemi was there too, at the edge of the group, thermos in hand. He did not say anything. He raised the thermos slightly, The way you raised a glass to someone, a gesture that required no translation, because the meaning of it was in the posture and not the words. Bricks stopped at the bottom of the ramp. He looked at all of them, the engineers, the soldiers, the scientist who had spent her career learning to say hello in a language nobody taught her, the man who had found a beach with the right geology and called it practical and meant it as a kind of warmth. He thought about what he had come here expecting. He thought about what he was leaving with. He thought about the manifold running at 79.3, and the hull holding tighter than the spec had promised, and the coolant cycling at a temperature it should not have been able to reach. He thought about the 47. He had one English phrase. He had been saving it because it was the only one, and it needed to go somewhere that mattered. He said, "Good coffee." Adeyemi smiled. It was a small smile, and it was real. "Come back," he said. "We'll make a better pot." The endless patience. Reached stable departure orbit at 1400 local time. Zelvorn sat the bridge himself for the departure, which he did not always do, but which felt correct today. He watched the planet on the display as they climbed out of its gravity, the blue widening, the white cloud cover resolving into pattern, the scale of it becoming apparent in the way that scale only became apparent from distance. Class 7, Pure Civilization. He had signed a form that the council said was invalid, and which a regulation said was not, and which 4 months from now a review board would either confirm or reject. And between now and then the designation stood, and while the designation stood, Earth was not a protectorate, and not a reserve, and not a footnote in a 41-year-old file. It was a peer, with a counter-offer on the table, and legal counsel in the appropriate channels, and an observer's record in a UN notebook in Geneva. He thought it would hold. He thought this not because he was optimistic, because he was not an optimistic man, but because the regulation was clear, and because Brix's technical documentation was thorough, and because the humans were, demonstrably, the kind of people who prepared for things. He had held a cup of coffee for 20 minutes, and they had not rushed him. He thought about that. He filed his own response to the council. It was formal, precise, and considerably shorter than their message to him. It cited Article 7, Section 4. It attached Brix's technical documentation, all 30 hours of it. It noted that the co-signature question was a matter of regulatory interpretation, and referred the council to their own legal division for clarification. It did not retract anything. He sent it and closed the channel. Navigator Preth looked at him from her station. She had the expression of someone who had understood everything that had happened and had filed it away and would not discuss it unless asked, which was one of the qualities that made her an excellent navigator. "Course set for the relay station," she said. "Good," he said. The planet shrank on the display. The blue diminished. The scale reversed. Enormous to vast, to a point of light that was no longer a place and not yet a memory. Zelvorn watched it go. 3 weeks later, in a building in Geneva, Liu Wei submitted a 47-page legal brief to the Collective Council via their publicly accessible administrative filing system, a system that had existed for 200 years and had never previously received a submission from a Class 3 civilization, because Class 3 civilizations did not know it existed. Earth had known about it for 11 years. They had found it in the intercepted transmissions. They had been preparing a submission for 6. The brief argued, in exhaustive and well-sourced detail, that the Class 7 designation was valid under Article 7, Section 4, that Liu Wei's presence and official record constituted recognized representative status under the plain language of the article, and that the Council's attempt to retroactively redefine that standard constituted a violation of their own regulatory framework. It was 47 pages long. Liu Wei had chosen that number deliberately. He had not mentioned this to anyone. Some things were for your own satisfaction. 40 light-years away, the Council read the brief. They read it slowly. They referred it to their legal division. Their legal division read it and asked for a week. The week passed and the legal division asked for another week, which was the first time in 200 years the legal division had needed 2 weeks for anything, which the Council noted in their internal record without pleasure. The legal division's eventual assessment was 7 pages long. It cited 17 precedents. Its conclusion was careful, narrow, and definitive. The designation was valid. A council member whose name the records do not preserve put the assessment down and looked at the window and said, to no one in particular, that they needed to send a trade delegation. Nobody disagreed. 3 weeks after that, the first official collective trade delegation arrived in the Sol system. They were not prepared for what they found. They had read the brief, and they had read Brix's technical documentation, and they had updated the file to Class 7. But reading about a thing and arriving at a thing are different in the way that all important differences are different. In the body rather than the mind, in the specific rather than the general. They were not prepared for the noise, for the satellites, for the way the planet lit up on every frequency at once, a civilization that had been talking to itself and to the dark for a long time, and had a great deal to say. They were not prepared for the welcome, which was not warm exactly. The humans were too precise for warm to be the right word, but which was ready, prepared. The counteroffer was already updated. The legal team was already briefed. Okafor was already at the communication station, which was where she was most days now, because there was more to listen to than ever before. Adeyemi met them on a different beach. He brought coffee. He brought enough for everyone. Somewhere in the collective's administrative record, filed under First Contact Events, Sol System, the official report from the Incident Assessment Board read, "The Sol System is no longer eligible for reserve or protectorate classification. Peer status confirmed per Article 7, Section 4. Recommend immediate reassessment of all Class 3 designations within 200 light-years. Classification criteria appear to contain significant systematic error. Cause under investigation. Estimated review timeline, 18 months. Note: recommend updated protocols for pre-contact civilizations that have accessed collective administrative systems. Current protocols assume no such access is possible. This assumption requires revision." Additional note: the beverage the human delegation provided to the trade delegation on arrival, a dark, bitter liquid served warm, has been requested by 4 delegation members for the return journey. Sourcing unclear. Follow-up required. The report was filed, stamped, and archived. On Earth, nobody read it for another 3 years, when a researcher in Okafor's department, going through the intercepted transmission archive, found it and printed it out and brought it down the hall. Okafor read it. She read the last note. She put it down on her desk. She laughed. Not a small laugh. The real kind, the kind that required a moment to recover from. She picked up her mug. She drank her coffee. Outside her window, the Kenyan morning was doing what Kenyan mornings did, arriving loud and warm and completely without apology, the sky coming in blue over the hills, the radio towers on the ridge catching the first light, everything exactly as it had always been, and completely different from what it used to mean. She had another call in 10 minutes. A delegation from a species 400 light-years out, newly arrived in the system, wanting to know what all the signals were. She pulled up her headset. She was ready. She had been ready for a long time.